I want to start off by looking at the start of your own book on who owns football, and you start off by discussing a game between Manchester City and Bury at Main Road in February 1998. I wondered if you could talk through why that kind of helped set the scene for the book and why that is quite a poignant, pivotal moment, really.
Yeah, well, I chose that game. The timeline doesn't kind of quite sort of match up because it wasn't like there was one. It was after this one game that these two teams diverged so much. But I just thought it was the perfect example of what an owner, good or bad, can do for a football club, and also kind of raise the question of what kind of constitutes a good football owner, because you would think from that game it was fairly kind of clear cut. The guy that eventually took over Bury and led them into kind of oblivion, and the old club is no longer there. There's a Phoenix club, but it's kind of slightly different. He seems like the bad one, and Sheikh Mansour, who took over Manchester City 10 years after that game, is the good one. But then you kind of get into questions about what constitutes a good owner, whether it is success on the pitch or whether you can really call someone who is kind of essentially using a football club for obviously the popular term is sports washing, is can ever be considered a good football club owner. So yeah, it was it was just a kind of one of those things that now seems kind of entirely implausible, that Manchester City and Bury were at the same level, but the situations could quite easily have been reversed if history had gone a different way, or they had got different owners at various points.
Yeah, absolutely. And you talk in the book as well about how perhaps historically people wouldn't have even known who perhaps the owner of their club was, or they certainly weren't as high profile as they are today. I wondered what you thought made that kind of topic of club ownership so significant in today's game.
I think it's just because I mean, it's partly our fault in the media, in that there is this sort of saturation of coverage of the media, of football in the media, that every aspect of it is kind of is put into a lot of focus. I mean, an example at the moment is everyone knows the name of Arsenal's set piece coach, which is probably not something that we absolutely need to know, but because there's such a saturated coverage, and everyone does know it. Um, but I mean, the sort of the bigger reason that it is all so kind of more widely known now is it's so the fact that you can make so much money, or people think that you can make so much money, means that you get these kind of enormous states, or you get enormous venture capitalist funds, or individual benefactors are rarer these days, but um, the people that kind of run football clubs are not just sort of functionaries or local businessmen who are in it for maybe to fluff up their own egos and make themselves feel important in the local community, as they were up until 30, 25 years ago. They are now these kind of um, internationally recognized and famous people. To the you've gone from people like local butchers owning their football club, to Tom Brady owning a admittedly very small slice of Birmingham City, but it's the changing kind of face of people who own football clubs is a kind of interesting, or quite an apt way to trace how much football has changed over the years as well.
Yeah, yeah, you mentioned there around the kind of the changing trends within ownership. I suppose I wondered if you could perhaps summarize that from, say, the start of the Premier League to what we face here in sort of 2024, 2025.
Yeah, well, there's a section in the first chapter, I think, of the book, where I go through the people who owned the 22 as it was then, 22 Premier League clubs in the first season of the Premier League in 1992. All of them, apart from one, were English. The one who wasn't English is Sam Haman, who's from Lebanon, but he wasn't a kind of um, you know some kind of financial vulture who'd come in to make a lot of money from a club that he had on the other side of the world. He'd moved to South London in the 1970s. He was, to all intents and purposes, a local businessman. And the majority of the other people who were kind of owned slash were chair people of their football club were local to that football club as well. Um, and they all came from none of these people were kind of poor. They were all kind of they all had made not very nice amounts of money in other industries outside football, but they were much closer to what you might call normal people than the rest of us. Like one guy made his money in paint, one guy made his money in caravan parks. So you didn't get any kind of venture capitalist or kind of massive conglomerates coming into own football clubs. It was all not quite normal people, but people who certainly had a lot more in common than with you and I than they do now.
And do you think this kind of the internationalization on globalization of the sport in terms of the ownership has been a positive for the sport, or is there aspects that are detrimental? I suspect that's quite a tricky question to answer, but
Yeah,
generally, how would you summarize that?
yeah, it is. It is quite a tricky question to give a definitive answer to because it sort of depends on a couple of things really. It depends on your point of view. It depends on I think you can get into a position where you're very kind of pointlessly nostalgic about football, and to think that you know, but generally speaking, people will think that football was the best when they were coming of age. So from my perspective, I went to my first game in 1989, and I can kind of think that, oh well, it was all everything was great back then, and it's all become a big mess now. So I think it has been detrimental in some respects, in as much as people now own football clubs for reasons that are not necessarily for the direct benefit of those football clubs. In years past, um, you didn't own a football club to make money. You couldn't make money out of football club owning a football club or being even on board of football clubs really. Um, but now most people who own Premier League clubs certainly are doing it with the ultimate aim to make money, to make a lot of money, whether that's directly through their football club or to kind of leverage the ownership of a football club into some other kind of financial financial gain for themselves, which often I don't pretend to understand how or why, but people who I spoke to for the book who are much smarter and much more knowledgeable about it than me assure me that this is the way that some people do it. And the other thing, of course, is to people, or should I say, states own football clubs for their own kind of geopolitical reasons, their own reasons to do with improving the image of their state or whatever it is. And from that point of view, it is it is a kind of negative. It is detrimental, if only because, and again, without wishing to go back to the pointless nostalgia route, without pretending that people who own football clubs in years gone by were all saints and they were doing it for noble reasons and for the good of the community or whatever else, you at least didn't really have to think about it that much. All you had to really think about was whether your team were good, and you could dislike the person at the top. You could dislike the chairman if you wanted, but you didn't really have to think about it much beyond that. Now you're almost kind of forced to think, well, why is this person in charge of my football club? Why has this person taken over my football club? Is it to make money? Is it to kind of sports wash? Is it to distract attention from something else? Is it any of these things? Which football is a kind of it is so intertwined with society and culture and politics and everything else that it's impossible to separate it. But I entirely sympathise with the point of view of people who just want it to be an escape, who just want it to be something they enjoy a couple of times a week, and they don't want to think about it. But the state of things as they are at the moment means that we're kind of forced to think about it, and from that point of view, it has been detrimental.
Mhm. There's a section towards the start of the book, and you talk about the number of clubs that perhaps have got that kind of traditional ownership model, the single benefactor essentially, versus now how many of the owners have multiple different clubs as part of a setup. I wondered if you could perhaps just talk through the kind of key differences between those trends, the modern trends in terms of these consortiums and kind of multi-club ownership models.
Yeah, well, multi-club ownership is, and it's only going to get bigger um, as as time goes on. And in some ways, it's kind of from a business perspective, certainly it's kind of perfectly logical. If you own, say, 4 clubs, then you can have. It's just like any other, in some respects, any other company that swallows up another company. When a bigger company takes over a smaller company, they will most likely get rid of the HR department, or they will get rid of the certain employees in some things to kind of streamline the business, which is what multi-club owners do. They have, rather than having a South American scout, for example, for each of their 4 clubs, they will just have one South American scout for all 4 of their clubs, and they will kind of look at various players, and um, they will they will sort of assign them to their different clubs. So from that perspective, there's a sort of economy to be had, and you if you're a bigger club and you're in some smaller clubs, you can send your young players out on loan. You can kind of use the smaller clubs to recruit players that will eventually end up at the bigger club. And it's kind of it so from that perspective, there's logic to it, but there's also a kind of power and like empire building thing. Like um, the one that's kind of seems to be growing at the moment is Evangelos Marinakis, who's owner of Nottingham Forest. The first club he owned was Olympiakos in his home in Greece. He's recently taken over Rio Ave in Portugal, and he's currently looking at clubs in Brazil, specifically Vasco da Gama. Now he is kind of a businessman, and he wants to make money. But the reason he is doing all of this is basically because owning one football club isn't enough. It's kind of he has this, you know, he has this sense that he wants to build this football empire, and he's spending an awful lot of money on doing so, and hiring a lot of kind of very high profile and well credentialed people to help him do that. So there are kind of various different kinds of multi club. You got multi club structure. You got things like Manchester City, where there is the definitive one club at the top of everything, and everything is kind of designed to filter up to Manchester City and make them better and make them more competitive. Then you have things like Red Bull, who RB Leipzig are the biggest club in their group, but it's not entire. The purpose isn't necessarily to make RB Leipzig the best team possible. The purpose for them is to sell fizzy drinks. And then you have kind of other groups like Marinakis. You have kind of smaller groups. There's a group I talk about and I speak to in the book called Orlegi, who own a couple of clubs in Mexico. They own a club in Spain, and they own one. Well, they're looking at the USA now. So, and then another one that I discuss in the book is a group called Mercury 13, who they're currently they're interesting because they started. It's not like Manchester City where they had one club and then they expanded. They have started with the express initial intention of being a multi-club group, but starting from scratch. So at the time of recording this, they only own one club, which is FC Como in Italy. And sorry, just say that they're exclusively focusing on women's football as well, because it's such a kind of growth industry, and there is, you know, that there is so much more space for it to grow into. So yeah, that's a very kind of long-winded and rambling way of saying that within multi-club ownership there are a wide variety of different structures that all can kind of serve different purposes.
Mm. I suppose at the other end of the spectrum, perhaps you've kind of got supporter ownership, which you talk about a lot, and how that model of ownership is often upheld as being quite virtuous and the ideal model to some extent. But do you think that's realistic? What do you see as being some of the pitfalls, or what are the kind of criticisms of that kind of model of ownership?
Well, I mean, the two main kind of criticisms or pitfalls of supporter ownership is a that in most circumstances, supporter ownership happens when a club is essentially on its arse and no one else will take the financial risk of getting involved. A group of fans will come together and kind of start running the club. Um, Probably the best example of that being Portsmouth, who, after the very chaotic years of ownership that they had in the kind of 2000s and early 2010s, the supporter ownership came in and kind of steadied them a little bit. That's when it goes right. The kind of the When it goes wrong, you get people who, well-intentioned people who, frankly, don't really know what they're doing and get clubs into a huge amount of trouble. I think the example I used in the book was Rotherham, who this group of supporters kind of came in and kind of almost self-admittedly didn't really know what they were doing. They started building this kind of new stand that is actually still there, half finished, at Millmoor in Rotherham, when they've long since moved to another ground. Um, so that's the kind of one pitfall or one criticism of it. And the other one is that there is a sort of natural ceiling to fan ownership, because unless you have an extremely wealthy single benefactor who um, will invest their own personal money into it, there just isn't the financial backing to get above a certain level. Um, the Currently the highest sort of truly supporter-owned club in England is Exeter City, who are in League One, and it is quite difficult to see them getting any higher than that. They could kind of sneak into the Championship, but it would take something pretty special for them to do that. And then, you know, from everyone that I spoke to, getting even higher than that, or getting a fan owned club into the Premier League is, about as close to impossible as you can kind of get in the way that English football is structured at the moment, certainly. Um, and sometimes the supporters of a club are perfectly happy to just kind of, to have fan owns a fan ownership structure, where there isn't a lot of money kind of put in, but they are happy to kind of bump up against that ceiling because they have well-intentioned people who are, running the football club and theoretically own the football club for good reasons. Um, and then sometimes you have a situation like Wrexham, where their fans owns the club. They had kind of they'd stagnated for a few years, and then Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney came in and bought the club. And I don't think anyone is necessarily pining for the days when the Wrexham Sports Trust were running the club. So I did a survey for the book, where I asked, I think it was about 1,500 fans, what would be their ideal form of ownership, and the overwhelming winner of that poll was fan ownership. So it is a sort of ideal scenario, but um, all of that is kind of in theory. When you are presented with the realities of it, then I think opinions kind of start to change fairly quickly.
Mhm. I suppose related to that, how do you think clubs should balance some of the priorities of local communities and I suppose the broader fan base within that with the interests of global audiences and the kind of globalization of the club?
I mean, I suppose this is not useful advice for anyone trying to own a football club, but the ideal is to be Tony Bloom at Brighton, where you are, you are a fan. You have a lot of money, but you also don't run the club like a fan. You don't make emotional decisions. You are very kind of, I suppose, cold and businesslike about how you do things. About selling a player that maybe people have become very attached to, but is makes financial sense, and you let managers go when someone else comes in, because you know that it's firstly you'll get the compensation, but also it's pointless trying to keep players like that. So managers like that, sorry. So yeah, they would seem to have the ideal balance at the moment. Um, but yeah, that doesn't necessarily. It's just saying be the ideal owner and just do it everything like that is not necessarily the best advice for anyone to go in. But yeah, but if you were to choose someone who's got that balance right, then Brighton is probably the best example.
You mentioned the kind of the rise of state ownership of clubs and the kind of increase in sports washing essentially. There's obviously been other instances of ownership which have had negative aspects to them. Do you foresee a shift towards stricter regulations in terms of who can own football clubs in the UK, similar to the likes of Germany and Sweden, or how do you envisage that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, Germany obviously kind of often held up as the ideal form, and certainly in an ideal world, I think English football um, would be better served in something like that. But I mean, that's not going to happen. I think in terms of kind of regulations, it does sort of partly depends on how much power the football regulator that is just kind of in its early stages of getting going now, how much power and scope for actually enforcing any of the things that people might want enforced it actually has. I mean, there's a sort of defeatist attitude, but it's all very well kind of me talking about, well, we should bring in these regulations as to ensure that states don't own clubs or whatever. But where you have wealthy people who want something, more often than not, they will find a way around those regulations. Like there are regulations at the moment that mean that in theory a state shouldn't own a football club, which is how. But kind of all it basically took to get around those regulations was, in the case of Saudi Arabia and Newcastle, for them to basically said, no, no, we've got nothing to do with the Saudi state. It's the Public Investment Fund, which has no connection to the state. And the Premier League said, yeah, then that seems fine, and just kind of waved it through. So that's again, it is a slightly defeatist attitude, but to a point, it doesn't matter how many regulations you put in place. The chances are that someone will find a way around it, which isn't necessarily a reason to kind of stop trying, or not to put in these regulations and to not to put in rules that will try and stop it. But if you think that putting in these regulations is going to stop things like that, then it's relatively unrealistic.
Thinking about the kind of future of club ownership, how do you envisage things like technology and blockchain and fan tokens? How might they influence club ownership in the future?
It's really interesting because at the moment they're influencing it in a very kind of superficial way. So you have Crawley Town at the moment, who are owned by a group called Wagami, which stands for We're All Going to Make It. And they are essentially kind of crypto and NFT speculators who a made quite a lot of money in that area, and then B took a look at English football, as many other people in other industries have done, and said, well, clearly the people who are running this are idiots, and they don't know what they're doing, but we know what we're doing, so we're going to try something different. And in theory, in theory, there's kind of nothing wrong with saying we're going to try something different because often the traditional ways of running a football club haven't been particularly successful. But it does, um, in their case, their use of new technologies and blockchain and whatever else has been very superficial in as much as that you could if you bought an NFT, for example, related to Crawley, you could vote for things like kits and what songs are being played when teams come out. So at the moment, it's all very kind of very on a very surface level. But in the future, who knows? I mean, you just don't know what. I realize there's a very unhelpful answer, but these things change so quickly. But you just don't know what the kind of scope of them will be and how they can be used to to help run a football club or generate funds to buy a football club or whatever it is. So it's just really I'm going to give the cop out answer by saying it's really difficult to tell.
Um, was there anything that was perhaps surprising or an insight that you weren't expecting when you were researching the book? Was there anything that kind of stood out to you, of interest?
Yeah, the what I did the thing I think found most surprising was how much I warmed to a team called #United, who on the face of it are they're kind of everything that a proper football fan in inverted commas or proper football man would dislike, in that they are a team that essentially sprung from YouTubers and sort of social media influencers. It started out as them just kind of playing games with their mates and putting it on their YouTube channel. But because their YouTube channel had millions of subscribers, it then kind of blossomed into something else. And the fact that the guy who is the kind of head of the whole thing is sort of rooted in non-league football. I think his family have been involved in non-league football for a long time. He wanted to take that and the publicity it had and turn them into an actual real football club that competed in the league pyramid, which they do now. Um, so in theory, it is all very kind of um, anathema to sort of traditional football. I don't know what the right phrase is, to traditional football attitudes. But I kind of found myself thinking, yeah, this is actually quite good. This is actually it's an interesting way of running a football club that isn't really harming anyone, and the people
Mm.
it's irritating are quite irritating in themselves. So um, I kind of found myself on their side, which I wasn't expecting, and there is a sort of, again, there might be a sort of ceiling to them, because the point of #United is they are kind of the internet's football club, and they don't really have that. They have a home ground where they play their home games, but they're not rooted in a place. That most football clubs are 100 years old, and they stem from works teams or churches or things like this, that they're all around a kind of local physical community, whereas the community that #United are built around is global and on the internet and less tangible. But that doesn't necessarily make it any less valid. So yeah, I think that was the thing that I found that surprised me the most. That I kind of found myself on #United side when it wasn't something that I was expecting.
Great. And lastly, I suppose, just finally, what kind of advice would you give to any supporters who wanted to have a greater voice in the game, or what lessons from your book are going to be relevant for those fans who want to kind of better understand how their clubs are run?
I mean, the kind of vague, broad brushstroke advice is just be as engaged as you possibly can, and just kind of speak up, because it can feel quite impotent being a football fan in 2024, 2025. Um, because you would think, well, we can put up little signs about ticket prices or something, and they will just get ignored. But sometimes they don't. Like a fan protest was a lot of the reason that the first kind of iteration of the Super League failed, and fan protest was a reason that there was a club in the Netherlands, NAC Breda, I think it was, that Manchester City tried to take over a few years ago. They tried to bring into City Football Group, but the fans kind of protested so vociferously that the deal was called off. This kind of that happened to a sort of slightly lesser extent in the very early days of Red Bull as well. So while it is kind of quite tempting just to be sort of fairly defeatist about it, and to think that your voice doesn't really mean anything or can't really have any effect, you sort of never know until you try. You never know until you actually do speak up about something. So it for advice such as this is stay as engaged as possible. Find out as much as about your owners and what they're up to and why they're owning your football club as you possibly can, and don't be a kind of cheerleader. There is a sort of sense that, and this is kind of true of most clubs when results are going well on the pitch, but there is a tendency to ignore everything else and ignore the context around a club owner if your team is winning. That doesn't necessarily mean that the more important, the higher issues are not still there.
Mm.
And if you still care about those issues, then to a point you have to ignore what's happening on the pitch, and you know hold your club to account and speak up when things that you don't agree with are happening, or things that you are morally opposed to are happening. Don't just kind of you know put Saudi dress on and say you don't care about, as long as as long as they spend money on a new striker for Newcastle or whatever. So yeah, as I said, you never really know when your voice will actually be heard or be important. So stay as informed as possible. Don't be cheerleaders and speak up when you can.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.